Hello, welcome to The Drum. I'm John Barron. Coming up, pressure mounts on the Prime Minister to confirm or deny bribes were paid to people smugglers as tensions rise with Indonesia. Did an ABC science show put thousands of lives at risk? And why all the fuss today about some 800-year-old list? And joining me on the panel tonight, journalist with Guardian Australia David Marr, Sue Cato from Cato Council, and theologian and rector Dr Michael Jensen. And you can join us as well on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum. Prime Minister Tony Abbott faced a censure motion in Parliament today over his continued refusal to confirm or deny payments were made to people smugglers to take asylum seekers back to Indonesia.
I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House censures the Prime Minister for leading a chaotic government. Australian taxpayers have a right to know in particular if their money is going to the most vile trade that both sides of this chamber have made the strongest comments against.
And what we now need to hear from the Prime Minister is a clear statement of clarity about whether or not people smugglers were paid to take people back to Indonesia.
Previous member asked for a clear statement. Here's a clear statement. We stopped the boats. We stopped the boats and they will stay stopped under this government.
And the motion failed along party lines. Meanwhile, the government has pushed back rather firmly against Indonesian concerns about possible bribes being paid. Foreign Minister Julie Bishop today is saying that Operation Sovereign Borders wouldn't be necessary if Indonesia enforced sovereignty over its own borders. Ouch. The Prime Minister says nothing illegal has been done, but is David Marr, the Prime Minister's continued silence on this, untenable?
Well, let's first of all not waste time on the issue about whether it happened or not. It happened. It clearly happened.
How do we know it happened?
It happened because, the Fairfax papers broke the story. They have a senior Indonesian police official who dealt with the case and interviewed two of the crewmen. We have a joint letter from up to 65 people who were on the boat, a joint letter to the people of New Zealand. They were heading for New Zealand. Australia paid the money to stop them going to New Zealand. Are we going to send the bill to Wellington?
Love for our Kiwi brothers, David. Have you got a problem for that?
And the United Nations High Commission for Refugees is also confirming it happened. It happened because there is everything in the government's favour, if it didn't happen, to say it didn't happen. It happened. So the question is, why did it happen? How squalid are we becoming in order to stop every boat? And what happens now? I mean, if I were a people smuggler, I'd gather a group of people together, steam out into the Indian Ocean, steam around for a while until the Australians heard about it, collect me money and take them back again. Be a fabulous trade.
So David says it happened. Do we know exactly, though, what it is? Because what it exactly was surely is pretty important. If, for instance, it turns out to be, well, we sent them back on some of these plastic dinghies of ours and we compensated them for the fact that we scuttled their fishing boat, and that, in fact, is us being a good international citizen, not leaving a hazard to navigation somewhere on a reef off Indonesia.
Well, you know, if we actually do get the AG's review, we'll get down to all of those facts. I think, though, if you're a reasonable person in the street, you have the Foreign Minister and Peter Dutton last week just shooting from the hip saying, no, it didn't happen. You've got various people saying, well, if it did happen, it happened for the right reasons. You've now got everybody being incredibly non-committal. I suppose one of the things that jars with me is that the reason that we were stopping the boats was to break the business model of the people smugglers. And if that's what we're doing, and, reading between the lines or reading, the big headlines in News Limited where we're saying that, ASIS might have been involved, etc., there's clearly a lot we don't know about. But to the average punter in the street, you're going, hang on, what's going on? And I think that's where, not to mention the global repercussions in terms of, Australia's positioning and being hardline on it. I think right now there are a huge number of questions that need to be answered, and it's a bit messy.
Michael, as to what the average person on the street might be thinking, Peter Dutton, the Prime Minister, all they need to be thinking is the boats have stopped.
Well, I mean, they're saying the boats have stopped, but clearly these boats hadn't stopped. These boats were out in the water, so it's still going on. I think what alarmed me most, though, was Abbott using the language of we're going to stop the boats by hook or by crook. We do what we have to do. And that's a language which actually says we're going to justify the ends or the means that we use by to get to any end that we want. We're going to do what we need to do. And we're going to put people's lives at risk to do it. Where principle be blowed, basically, as far as I can see.
But if the objective is to stop people taking a hazardous journey and dying in the process, the government's rationale is we are saving thousands of lives by stopping the boats. Of course, we're going to potentially try new and innovative things, maybe even buying back boats. We took that to the last election.
The hypocrisy is extraordinary, though, in that the rationale, the language of actually saying no to people smuggling was used in the whole development of the policy that's brought us to this position. So I can't see why that really works as a kind of just way of operating this system, this supposed Operation Sovereign Borders.
David, given that there is the suggestion that potentially the veil of secrecy is not just about on-water matters, but also if Australia's security agency, if ASIS is involved, for instance, we might never know what happened, who was carrying what bundle of money for what purpose on that boat.
The claim by the Australian government and previous Australian governments that everything that happens out there to stop asylum seeker boats must remain secret is outrageous. This is not an invasion. This is not a military operation. There's a military element to it. This afternoon, in question time, the Foreign Minister was talking about intelligence matters. This is just rubbish. These are not secret. And by the way, we know what happened. 6 members of the crew were paid $5,000 US each to take these people back to Indonesia. They were paid in $100 US bills. When those people got back to Indonesia, the Indonesian police did not confiscate the money from the people smugglers. This is a perfect business model from a country that makes it a crime, rightly a crime, for Australian businessmen to bribe officials abroad. This is a country which is now known internationally as a bribing nation to stop would-be refugees coming to this country.
So does that pass the common sense test, though? If a lot of play has been made about taking the sugar off the table, but starting to bribe people smugglers, that just invites people to turn up at what the opposition has characterised as floating ATMs.
So none of it adds up. So I think, the caravan may move on in the next week or so, but the way this has been handled from go to woe, from the moment the story was broken by the SMH to today, there are actually more questions, there's more pain, there's more reputational bruising, and you have to ask yourself, it must be something really extraordinary for the government to be taking this much embarrassment globally.
Does the lack of transparency on this bother you, Michael?
Well, that certainly does bother me but I think, being perhaps a bit cynical here, I think it actually reads well for the government to be thought to be doing this thing. I think the more they can say, stop the boats, the more Tony Abbott can sound like a football coach saying, we'll do what it takes. I think the better it plays for him electorally, actually. So
Do you think he's being deliberately coy here, saying, let's just keep this going for a few days because we like playing on this turf?
Well, that might be a little cynical, but I entertain that thought that actually this mightn't go well in Fairfax media, right? But it's not going to be so bad in wider Australia. People clearly go for this stop the boats, and that's what worries me here. Is that we talk about the politicians at one level, but there's something about our hearts here, the hearts of our nation, that we are so easily appealed to by this relentless stop the boats rhetoric over such a strange, bizarre issue. It's been going for 15 years or more now. This sort of rhetoric, and I ask us really to have a bit of a soul search about what it says about our compassion. We're not a compassionate nation.
All right. Well, there's another story that got quite a going over in Parliament today. Despite a new opinion poll this morning from Ipsos showing that close to 70% of Australians, an all-time high, now support marriage equality, opponents of gay marriage within the federal government are warning of a potential electoral backlash. Polling being circulated among MPs reportedly suggests that at least 3, as many as 5 coalition seats could be at risk in a half-Senate election from a backlash, particularly among ethnic communities. Debate resumed on Labor leader Bill Shorten's marriage equality bill today, but the father of the House, Philip Ruddock, who supports marriage equality, accused the opposition of having politicised this issue.
It is extremely disappointing to me and my colleagues that the opposition took the approach that they did, and we would encourage them to withdraw and to allow some further discussions.
We will now redouble our efforts to work with the Labor Party, the Coalition and Independents to get a bill sponsored by all sides, that's owned by the Parliament, and try to achieve a rare moment of unity in an otherwise very, very divided Parliament.
It is time, it is well past time, that this Parliament says to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex Australians, we recognise that you love, and that's more important than who you love.
So, David Marr, does a Conservative backlash loom for those coalition senators if this debate goes forward?
Of course there is now a Conservative backlash. We are at the end game of this operation. And I'm old enough to remember the end game against no-fault divorce, which was, overwhelmingly wished for by the Australian people. The end game has 2 elements to it. One is for the opponents to say, I know there aren't many of us left, but our passion is such that we have a right to veto. And the other element is to say, be careful here, you might lose a seat. And this morning's gambit was, be careful here, you might lose a seat. The figures being used in the report in The Australian were out of date, grossly out of date. The support for getting on with this issue is enormous. It doesn't really look like a government changer, or indeed much of a game changer. The Australian people just want it to happen.
Out of date, given that the modelling was from early electoral cycles where
the figures were out of date. They quoted a figure of something like 52% support for same-sex marriage in one of the sort of surveys they were breaking down to show this hugely dangerous coalition of Christian forces in the Senate. But it's not that. It's 68%, and indeed it's huge. It's 57% of coalition voters want it. There is a tiny cabal on the Labor side as well as the coalition side, passionately angry about this change. And the question for Australian politics is, can we in Australia do what has been able to be done in France, where the Catholic Church was faced down, in Spain, where the Catholic Church was faced down, in Ireland, where the Catholic Church was faced down? Can we face down the church in Australia?
David's rhetoric is typical of the sort of process of the language of inevitability here. Australians don't like to be told that things are inevitable. It was supposed to be inevitable that we had a republic about 16 years ago. And I remember the kind of shocked dismay from the sort of media pundits at the time when the republic didn't eventuate. I voted for it myself. I think the thing here is, at one level, I think whether the coalition loses seats or not, that's irrelevant. I think the politicians should do the right thing, what they think is the right thing to do. Whether they lose seats or not, they should be morally courageous on either side of the argument. I think that's very important. I think the language of equality in this debate has been used, and Australians are a little bit suspicious here because it really is a redefinition of marriage that we're talking about. And once that discussion comes up, it becomes a little bit less...
How great is that suspicion, though? Because it almost seems as though this is the reverse of the Republic, in that we've got this groundswell, 68%, an all-time high, according to Ipsos. And some other polls that have been put around by the Christian lobby also say that it's majority, but it's not. It is more like 52%. So, I mean, it comes down to an extent as to whose poll you believe in all this, but there's still a majority.
When people start saying this is inevitable, then they've stopped actually arguing or making their case. And I think we still want to hear from both sides. We want to hear argument. We want to hear good argument. I also despair that actually there's a nasty tinge coming in the pro case, a kind of triumphalism, which again I think is not helpful for civil discourse in this country. I think there's also bad examples on the other side. However, having said all that, I think it's important for churches to say it might well be the case, for people like me to say it may well be the case that this social change comes through. I think it's a redefinition. I think it's a piece of social engineering. I think it will change things more than people say. However, it's important to remain positive towards our society and our community and make ground now for a discussion about what marriage should mean for all of us in the community, under the grounds of faithfulness in particular.
So on the question of whether the Australian people are being rushed into it, has Bill Shorten overplayed his hand by bringing it on? He was clearly seeking to capitalise on momentum coming out of the Irish vote, but are they now actually putting people of goodwill and good conscience into a position of, well, I don't know yet what to do? Well,
let's stand back for a second and talk about the scare campaign. There's nothing more scary if you're running around Parliament that some of your number might lose your seats, especially if it's yours. So if we're talking about tactics, I mean, that's a fairly ugly and brutal one. And you're right, David, this is old polling. It was jarring to me when I read it, because I've been chatting to people who are actually doing, contemporary polling.
But lobbyists circulate the poll that supports their case.
No, these are people doing wider polling who are just throwing questions in the qual work that they're doing. And I said to them, okay, bottom line, tell me what's happening in these qual focus groups. So you're getting a group of people. And what they're telling me is that the focus groups, for them it's a non-event. It's all moved on. Everybody's saying, yes, this has got to happen, and yes, we know politicians can get in the way, but what the focus groups, and these are focus groups being run in seats that are really marginal, so real swingers, you might have one person in a group who gets angry and cross about it, and the rest of them get all a bit embarrassed. It's a non-event. It's not going to win votes, but it's also not going to lose votes. And as soon as our politicians can get their heads around it, the rest of the community are by and large going to settle into it. And you're right, it is social engineering, and it's time the government got out of the way.
All right, we've got to move on, because it was a big day today for fans of 13th century documents, particularly the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. It was a piece of parchment that turned 800 this afternoon. The agreement between the English king and a bunch of noblemen is seen as a foundation document of Western democracy. In a nutshell, it's something along the lines of nobody's above the law, not even the king. And today, 8 centuries on, Magna Carta was trending on Twitter. Can you believe it? And it was the talk of Canberra as well.
Perhaps the most important constitutional document of all times that has shaped our history and that of so much of the modern world.
We salute the Magna Carta as a flickering candle, a compass, a guiding star.
But why is Magna Carta so important? A flickering candle, a guiding star. And why has it taken 800 years for us to be told not to call it the Magna Carta, just Magna Carta? Nicholas Cowdery is a renowned QC and member of the Magna Carta Committee. And we can call it the Magna Carta Committee and still be correct, Nicholas?
Absolutely.
Why does this thing matter?
Well, it's a myth of history, and it's a myth with magical qualities, the idea of the Magna Carta. And you notice I said the Magna Carta. I can't see any reason why we should take the definite article away from it. The other words are just Latin that means big charter.
Doesn't mean the big charter?
No, it just means big charter.
I'm going to take your word for that.
And the reason why, it's very interesting to hear those grabs from politicians, because what document are they talking about? There were 8 different issues of the document that we collectively call the Magna Carta during the 13th century. It began with one in 1215, yes, on the 15th of June 1215, that was sealed, not signed, by King John at Runnymede on the River Thames. And it was not on parchment, it was on vellum, which is untanned animal skin, either from a calf or a sheep. And it was laboriously written by scribes in continuous medieval Latin script, with a lot of abbreviations, because they had to get a lot of words onto the area of the vellum.
So it was a lot like a tweet of its time.
It took a bit longer than a tweet. I just happen to have here with me...
Here's one you prepared earlier.
One I prepared earlier.
A Magna Carta?
Just in case I was to appear.
So what in that is relevant today? I mean, do those words appear in our laws, or do they underpin the vibe of the thing?
There is one chapter, which is the correct description, not clause, not article, one chapter of the Magna Carta of 1297, which is the version that actually became law in England, which is law in New South Wales. The Imperial Acts Application Act of 1969 declared that Chapter 29 of the 1297 version is law in New South Wales, and it still is. And it's a very important chapter because it's a contraction of chapters 39 and 40 of the 1215 document, if you want to trace it back through the 8 different versions, which ensures due process of law. And the phrase that you hear cited very often, to no one shall we deny, to no one shall we delay justice,
So were these things already understood and in practice, or was this document important because for the first time it actually said, this is how we will proceed from this point, these are effectively the equivalent of a Charter of Rights, if you will?
There's very little in it that was new at the time, very little. There are a few provisions that were novel, but for the most part it was declaring the pre-existing law of England and the usages of England, the common law, if you like. And the reason why it needed to be declared and to be reaffirmed was that naughty old King John had been ignoring it. And that had started in the time of his father, Henry II. And the merchants, the barons, the people of England became very concerned about the way in which the king was just riding roughshod over the law that had been accepted for centuries, at least back to the time of Henry I's coronation charter of 1100. And they needed to do something about it. It was a time of enormous economic activity in England, the 12th and 13th centuries, and people wanted the law to be settled and to be observed, and this was a way of forcing the king to do that.
At some point did it go to beyond simply reflecting the current arrangements to forming the basis of future arrangements? Did it have that sort of power to get put in a bottom drawer and never seen again for 799 years?
Well, the document that was sealed in 1215 was in force for 9 weeks.
Right.
So it's a bit late to have the 9-week anniversary. The reason for that was that King John never had any intention of honouring the obligations that he was taking on in the document. And he sent a messenger off to the Pope in Rome. Of course, the church at that time was the Roman Church. And the Pope annulled the Charter of Liberties, as it was called, on the 24th of August 1215. So it lasted about 9 weeks. Now that's not much of a track record for a document that was going to lay the foundation for civilisation for the rest of eternity.
So would you say that it's been overhyped, or does it remain important?
No, it hasn't. It hasn't been overhyped for this reason, that the myth, the idea of Magna Carta remains essential, remains vitally important. And that myth, the idea behind it, is the establishment and the assertion of the rule of law, which we've since developed and built upon over the centuries. The interesting thing is that from 1300, when Edward first issued his version of Magna Carta, by then it was called Magna Carta, from then till the early 1600s, it disappeared. It just wasn't important in public life in England at all, until Sir Edward Coke in the early 1600s revived it, made it the feature piece of his second volume of the Institutes of the Laws of England.
And now it goes on world tour,
gave it a new
like
life.
a rock star. It's carried around the place like an artefact.
And there are so many versions of it, and they're not all exactly the same.
Nick Cowdery, we go on talking about this for hours. We are out of time, but there is a special edition of Q&A on ABC TV tonight that is going to be going into all of these issues and more. Thank you very much for joining us on The Drum.
Pleasure.
Now, finally tonight, more than 60,000 Australians apparently cut back or stopped taking cholesterol-lowering drugs altogether following that controversial ABC Catalyst program on heart disease. That's according to researchers at the University of Sydney, who say that it could cause up to 2,900 preventable and even potentially fatal heart attacks as a result. This 2013 TV program, which was found to have breached the ABC's impartiality standards and has now been taken offline as well, looked at claims that statin drugs were being overprescribed.
We've been told that medications to lower cholesterol will save lives.
We repeatedly hear from patients that their doctors tell them, if you don't take this, you will die.
Over 40 million people worldwide take drugs to lower their cholesterol. But now there's evidence that the majority of them won't benefit.
None of those people are less likely to die.
I speak to doctors accusing the drug companies of distorting the evidence about the drug's side effects.
Of course they're going to try to minimize the adverse events because that will increase the sales of their drugs.
Now, researchers say that the sudden drop in patients filling statin prescriptions coincides with the airing of that program. But, David Marr, can a TV show really stop tens of thousands of people taking a tablet prescribed to them by their doctor because they've got a bad heart?
I've always argued for the immense power and influential reach of the ABC. So I have no doubt what... Look, how can we tell? How can we tell? What this is a measure of, actually, is that 60,000 fewer people who already had prescriptions for statins did not go and fill their repeats. That's what it's a measure of. And yes, the fact that it came after that show, which I didn't see, but I've read the criticism of it, is interesting. It's a very interesting hypothesis. I'm not sure that it exactly proves they're connected. Certainly they're there in time.
Yeah, they're certainly coincidental, Sue, and the researchers also controlled it, and they looked at previous periods and everything else, and they could find no other reason other than the airing of this show, which did raise these concerns that some people were being put on statin drugs and having worse health outcomes because of things like bleeds and strokes and so on than their original heart malady. So do you accept that it could have had that level of influence on people?
I suppose my focus, I mean, look, circumstantially it looks like obviously it was, and clearly the Medical Journal of Australia is making the causal link, so I'm not to argue with them because they know more about it than I do. But David, to your point, you know, it does show how powerful Catalyst and shows of its nature are, and the incredible importance, and I'm sure Catalyst editorially think these are really important matters, and it's not the first brawl that Catalyst has been in. I suppose one of my questions is, A, are people being looked after? But secondly, for every news show that Catalyst does this make them braver or less brave?
Yeah, I mean, is that a valid question, particularly given that there's clearly been a lot of blowback because of this story? People that have been working in this area, doctors, have been very concerned that this was going to happen, and according to this evidence, it has happened. People are off their pills.
I think this is a great evidence that there is a devastating potential in bull dust to do actual harm to people. That we have these plausibility structures around the media and this thing called science, which we don't scrutinise very often. You know, we don't actually.
But this program was all about scrutinising science. It wasn't like a drink this coconut water or use this magnetic pillow, which you might.
True, but it kind of had this sort of veneer of expertise, and also it had involved in it too the lovely sort of sense that actually someone's been pulling the wool over our eyes all this time. So here's an expose. So it had this sort of plausibility to it, and I think we need to kind of take a bit of a check here and say, just because cranks are sometimes right, because unfortunately cranks are sometimes right, doesn't mean that cranks are always right, or that you're entitled to believe cranks. And I think there's a sort of responsibility of both journalists and just ourselves not to just take, because they're a crank, that we should believe them.
It's a good point, and we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us on another edition of The Drum. We thank our panellists tonight, David Marr, Sue Cato and Michael Jensen. You can check the website, abc.net.au/The Drum. I hope you can join us here, same time tomorrow. Bye for now.